They had marched 32 miles in 2 days through the jungle hills of northern Luzon, and Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto believed this made him part of an elite fighting force. His feet were blistered inside his split-toed tabi boots. His shoulders ached from the weight of his Arisaka rifle, ammunition pouches, entrenching tool, and the rice bag that contained his rations for the next week. The pack on his back held everything he owned: a spare uniform, a blanket, personal items wrapped in oiled cloth, and the small notebook where he recorded his thoughts each evening when the company stopped to rest. It was January 19th, 1945. Yamamoto's unit, the 103rd Infantry Regiment of the Imperial Japanese Army's 105th Division, was moving south through the Cordillera Central Mountains to reinforce defensive positions against the American invasion force that had landed at Lingayen Gulf 9 days earlier. The Americans were pushing inland. Japanese commanders needed every available unit to slow their advance, to buy time for the construction of defensive lines deeper in the mountains. Yamamoto had joined the army in 1942, trained at the depot in Kumamoto, and shipped to the Philippines in 1943. He had never seen combat. His regiment had been stationed in garrison duty in northern Luzon, training for the invasion everyone knew would come eventually. Now it had come, and his regiment was marching to meet it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The march itself was not unusual. Every Japanese soldier trained extensively in forced marches. The Imperial Army's infantry regulations specified that a standard march pace was 4 kilometers per hour, sustained for 8 to 10 hours per day. A well-conditioned infantry battalion could cover 40 kilometers in a day, approximately 25 miles, carrying full equipment. This was not theory. This was practice, drilled into every soldier from basic training onward. Yamamoto had completed marches of 50 kilometers during training, 31 miles in a single day, with only brief rest stops. The instructors had been clear about why this mattered. Japan's empire stretched across thousands of miles of territory, much of it without roads suitable for vehicles. The jungle terrain of Southeast Asia, the mountains of China, the islands of the Pacific. All of this required infantry who could move on foot, quickly and efficiently, without depending on mechanical transport. The philosophy went deeper than mere logistics. It was rooted in seishin, the concept of fighting spirit that permeated Japanese military culture. A soldier who could endure physical hardship, who could march all day and still fight at the end of it, possessed the spiritual strength that would overcome material disadvantages. The Americans and British, Japanese, propaganda insisted, were soft. They relied on machines because they lacked the discipline and endurance that came from proper training and spiritual cultivation. Yamamoto had absorbed these lessons. He believed them. When he looked at the men around him, fellow soldiers from farms and villages across Japan, men who had been shaped by the same training system, who carried the same equipment and followed the same regulations, he saw an infantry force capable of extraordinary feats. They could move through terrain vehicles could not traverse. They could operate independently of supply columns for days at a time, living on rice and whatever they could forage. They were, in the terminology their officers used, self-sufficient warriors. The concept of infantry mobility through marching was not unique to Japan. Every army in history had moved primarily on foot until the Industrial Revolution began to change warfare in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What made the Japanese approach distinctive was how thoroughly it had been systematized and how deeply it was tied to national ideology. Japanese military planners in the 1920s and 1930s studied warfare extensively. They examined the campaigns of the First World War, where millions of men had marched to battlefields across Europe. They studied the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, where Japanese infantry had moved rapidly through Manchuria to defeat a larger Russian force. They looked at their own ongoing operations in China, where Japanese divisions advanced hundreds of miles through territory with minimal road infrastructure. The lessons seemed clear. Infantry that could march long distances while maintaining combat effectiveness had a decisive advantage in the vast theatres of Asia. Roads were few and often impassable during monsoon seasons. Railways existed only in limited areas. Motor vehicles required fuel, spare parts, and maintenance facilities that were difficult to establish in remote regions. But soldiers with strong legs, proper training, and sufficient rations could go anywhere. The Imperial Army's infantry manual, revised in 1940, specified in detail how march discipline should be maintained. Units would march in column, maintaining proper spacing to avoid congestion. Officers would set a sustainable pace, typically 75 steps per minute for long-distance movement. Rest breaks occurred every hour, lasting 10 minutes, during which soldiers would remove their packs, sit, and attend to their feet. Longer rest periods happened at midday and evening. The manual emphasized foot care. Soldiers were instructed to keep their tabi boots dry when possible, to treat blisters immediately with the medical supplies each squad carried, and to massage their feet during rest breaks to maintain circulation. Officers were responsible for monitoring their men's physical condition and adjusting march pace, if necessary, to prevent excessive casualties from exhaustion. Rations during marches were carefully calculated. Each soldier carried enough rice for several days, supplemented by pickled vegetables, dried fish, and occasionally tinned meat. The standard daily ration provided approximately 2,500 calories, sufficient to sustain a soldier during moderate physical exertion. During forced marches, additional rations would be issued if available, though in practice, supply often fell short of these ideals. The weight each soldier carried was substantial but manageable. The Arisaka Type 38 or Type 99 rifle weighed approximately 9 pounds. Ammunition pouches held 60 rounds in stripper clips, adding another 4 pounds. The backpack with clothing, blanket, and personal items weighed 15 to 20 pounds. Entrenching tools, bayonets, canteens, mess kits, and gas mask pouches added another 10 pounds. A soldier on the march carried between 50 and 60 pounds of equipment. This load was lighter than what American or British infantry typically carried, reflecting different doctrinal priorities. Japanese infantry were expected to be mobile and self-sufficient, carrying only essential items. Heavier equipment, artillery, ammunition reserves, medical supplies, all of this would follow in the unit's baggage train, either on pack animals or in the limited vehicles available. Training for this kind of warfare began in basic training and continued throughout a soldier's service. New recruits spent months conditioning their bodies for long marches. They started with shorter distances, 10 or 15 kilometers, and gradually increased to the full 40-kilometer standard. They learned to pace themselves, to recognize signs of exhaustion in themselves and their comrades, to maintain formation even when exhausted. The training was harsh. Instructors believed that soldiers needed to experience real hardship during training, so they would be prepared for combat conditions. Recruits who fell behind during marches faced physical punishment and public humiliation. Those who could not maintain the pace were dismissed as unsuitable for infantry service. The system selected for physical endurance and mental toughness. Yamamoto had survived this training. He remembered the first long march during basic training, a 30-kilometer exercise in summer heat. He had struggled during the final hours, his vision narrowing, his legs moving mechanically while his mind drifted. He had kept going because stopping meant failure, and failure meant shame before his fellow soldiers and his family back home. When the march ended and he collapsed in the designated rest area, he had felt pride alongside the exhaustion. He had proven he could endure. That pride stayed with him. It was shared by every soldier who completed training, every veteran who had marched through China or Southeast Asia, every officer who planned operations based on the assumption that Japanese infantry could move faster and farther on foot than enemy forces dependent on vehicles. The marching ability of Japanese infantry was not just a practical military capability. It was an identity, a source of confidence, a tangible proof that spiritual strength and discipline mattered more than industrial production. When Yamamoto's regiment received orders to march south to meet the American invasion, he had accepted this as normal. This was what infantry did. They marched to where they were needed. They carried their weapons and equipment. They arrived ready to fight. The 32 miles his unit had covered in 2 days was well within standard expectations. Yes, the terrain was difficult, climbing through mountain passes and descending into valleys. Yes, the January heat was oppressive. But they were making progress, moving toward their objective, doing exactly what their training had prepared them to do. On the afternoon of January 20th, 1945, Yamamoto's company reached a ridgeline overlooking Route 3, the main highway running south from Lingayen Gulf toward Manila. They were to take up defensive positions here to harass American supply convoys moving inland. The company commander, Captain Nakamura, gathered his platoon leaders to survey the terrain and assign sectors. Yamamoto, as a squad leader despite his low rank, accompanied his platoon lieutenant to observe. From the ridgeline, they could see several miles of the highway. It was a dirt road, 2 lanes wide, cutting through agricultural land that had been abandoned when fighting began. The fields were empty now. Farmhouses stood silent. In the distance, smoke rose from what had been a small town before American artillery had worked it over. Then Yamamoto saw something that made him question what he was observing. A convoy was moving up the highway from the north. Not a small convoy, not a dozen vehicles, hundreds of vehicles, stretching back along the road as far as he could see. They moved in a steady stream, maintaining consistent spacing, raising dust that hung in the afternoon heat. He raised the binoculars Captain Nakamura had passed to him. Through the lenses, the vehicles resolved into individual machines. They were trucks, identical trucks, painted in a drab green-brown colour, each with a canvas cover over the cargo bed. They moved at perhaps 30 kilometers per hour, not fast, but steady and inexorable. One truck passed every few seconds. The column seemed endless. Yamamoto counted. In 5 minutes, he counted 73 trucks. If the convoy continued at this rate, and if what he could see was representative of the entire column, then more than 800 trucks would pass this point in an hour. He lowered the binoculars and looked at Captain Nakamura, who was watching with an expression Yamamoto could not read. "They are moving an entire division," the captain said quietly. "Perhaps more than one division." The lieutenant, a young officer who had graduated from military academy only 2 years earlier, seemed uncertain. "Sir, that many vehicles? Where did they get so many trucks?" Captain Nakamura did not answer immediately. He took the binoculars back and studied the convoy himself. Then he said, "The Americans have more trucks than we have soldiers." Yamamoto would later learn that this statement was, if anything, understated. The vehicle he was watching was the GMC CCKW, designated by the U.S. Army as the 2.5-ton, 6x6 truck. The designation referred to its cargo capacity and its drive configuration. All 6 wheels, powered for operation on rough terrain. American soldiers called it the Deuce and a Half, or simply Jimmy. General Motors Corporation had begun production of the CCKW in 1941. The design was straightforward, reliable, and standardized. It used a GMC 6-cylinder engine producing 91 horsepower, giving the truck a top speed of 45 miles per hour on roads. The cargo bed could carry 5,000 pounds of supplies, or, when configured for troop transport, 24 men sitting on benches along the sides. In practice, units often loaded more men, standing in the bed or sitting on equipment, bringing the total to 30 or even 36 soldiers when necessary. The truck's fuel tank held 40 gallons, providing a range of approximately 240 miles on roads, less on rough terrain. It had a 2-speed transfer case, allowing it to operate in low range for difficult conditions or high range for road travel. The suspension was simple and robust, designed for operation on roads that American engineers would not have considered roads at all, merely packed dirt or gravel surfaces. By January 1945, General Motors had produced over 400,000 of these trucks. They were everywhere in the American military, in Europe and the Pacific, hauling supplies, moving troops, towing artillery, carrying ammunition, evacuating wounded, transporting fuel. The CCKW was the standard tactical vehicle that made American divisions mobile at a scale no other army in history had achieved. Yamamoto knew none of these specifications. He knew only what he could see. The Americans had trucks in quantities that seemed impossible. His own regiment had perhaps 20 trucks for its entire 3,000 men, and half of those were broken down at any given time, waiting for spare parts that never arrived. The Japanese army relied on horses, oxen, and human porters to move supplies forward from railheads or ports. An infantry regiment on the march pulled its artillery with horses. Ammunition moved forward on pack animals or on the backs of soldiers detailed to carrying duty. The convoy continued for 3 hours. Yamamoto's company remained in position, watching. Captain Nakamura had decided against attacking. A convoy this large would have substantial security, infantry riding in some of the trucks, possibly armoured, vehicles interspersed among the cargo trucks. An ambush might destroy a few vehicles but would bring immediate retaliation. American artillery would saturate this ridgeline. American aircraft would appear within an hour. The risk was not justified by the potential damage to such a large convoy. A few destroyed trucks would mean nothing when hundreds more followed. As the sun dropped toward the western horizon, the convoy finally ended. The last trucks passed, trailing dust. Then came a different type of vehicle, smaller, open-topped, moving faster. Jeeps, Yamamoto had heard them called. Command vehicles. They zipped past, carrying officers or messenger personnel. Behind them, the road was empty again. Captain Nakamura dismissed the observation post. The company would remain in position overnight, rest, and continue south in the morning toward the secondary defensive line where the regiment was concentrating. As Yamamoto returned to his squad's position, he could not stop thinking about what he had seen. His regiment had marched 32 miles in 2 days. They had arrived exhausted, feet blistered, low on rations because the supply train had fallen behind on the mountain trails. They would need a day to rest before they could fight effectively. The American division he had just watched move past had covered the same distance, perhaps more, in a few hours. The soldiers riding in those trucks would arrive fresh, well-fed, fully equipped. They would be ready to fight immediately. The disparity was crushing. Yamamoto had been taught that Japanese soldiers were superior because they could endure hardship, because they did not need the comforts and machinery that Western armies required. But what he had observed made a mockery of that teaching. The Americans did not need to endure hardship because they had eliminated it. They did not march because they rode. They did not carry supplies on their backs because trucks carried supplies for them. They did not arrive exhausted because they conserved their strength for fighting rather than walking. That night, Yamamoto wrote in his notebook by the light of a small candle stub. He described what he had seen. He tried to calculate how many men could be moved by such a convoy. If each truck carried 24 men, a conservative estimate, and if the convoy had contained 1,000 trucks, another conservative estimate, then 24,000 men had passed that point in an afternoon. An entire division, moved in hours, arriving ready to fight. He wrote, "We have been told that our spirit is stronger than American machines. But machines do not grow tired. Machines do not get blisters. Machines do not need to rest. How do we fight machines when we have only our legs?" The GMC CCKW was only the most visible symbol of American motorization. Behind those trucks on Route 3 was an industrial system that Japanese planners had never fully comprehended. The United States had entered World War II as the world's largest automobile manufacturer. In 1941, American factories had produced more than 3 million civilian vehicles. When war came, those factories converted to military production with a speed and efficiency that reflected decades of development in mass production techniques. General Motors, Ford Motor Company, Chrysler Corporation, Studebaker, and dozens of smaller manufacturers turned their assembly lines to producing military vehicles. The designs were standardized to allow parts interchangeability. A transmission from a GMC truck could be installed in a Chevrolet truck of the same class. Wheels, axles, electrical systems, all were designed to common specifications. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Production numbers reflected this industrial capacity. In 1943 alone, American factories produced 812,000 trucks of all types. In 1944, production reached 860,000 trucks. These numbers did not include jeeps, of which over 600,000 were built during the war, nor half-tracks, amphibious vehicles, or specialized variants. By comparison, Japan's entire motor vehicle production in 1944 was approximately 28,000 vehicles of all types, military and civilian combined. This included trucks, staff, cars, and specialized vehicles. The ratio was approximately 30-1. For every vehicle Japan produced, the United States produced 30. This disparity extended beyond mere numbers. American vehicles were generally more reliable, requiring less maintenance and operating longer between breakdowns. They used standardized parts that could be supplied through an organized logistics system. Repair depots were established throughout operational theaters, stocked with spare parts and staffed by trained mechanics. A broken vehicle could often be repaired and returned to service within days. Japanese vehicles, by contrast, were produced by multiple manufacturers with limited standardization. Parts were not always interchangeable. Supply systems struggled to deliver the correct components to units in the field. Repair facilities were scarce. A truck that broke down often remained broken, cannibalized for parts to keep other vehicles running. The fuel situation was even more challenging for Japan. American forces had access to essentially unlimited fuel supplies. Tankers brought petroleum products across the Pacific. Fuel depots were established at every major base. Trucks could refuel frequently, operating at maximum efficiency without concern for conservation. Japanese forces, blockaded by American submarines and facing chronic fuel shortages, had to ration fuel carefully. Even when vehicles were available, they often could not operate because fuel was not. 2 days after watching the convoy, Yamamoto's regiment received orders to move again. The American advance was faster than Japanese commanders had anticipated. The defensive positions they had been ordered to occupy were already threatened with encirclement. The regiment needed to withdraw further south, to the next line of mountains where the terrain might slow the American advance. They marched through the night, trying to stay ahead of American mechanized columns. Yamamoto's company covered 18 miles between sunset and dawn, moving as fast as exhausted men could manage. They passed through villages where civilians watched silently from their homes, recognizing that the Japanese army was retreating, understanding what this meant. At dawn on January 23rd, they stopped to rest in a village that had been designated as a supply point. Yamamoto's squad found a spot under the eaves of an abandoned store and collapsed, too tired even to prepare food. They would rest for a few hours, then continue. An hour later, Yamamoto was awakened by the sound of engines. Not Japanese engines, with their rough diesel clatter. Different engines, smoother, more powerful. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the edge of the building, looking down the village's main street. American trucks were entering the village from the north. The column moved slowly, infantry dismounting from the trucks and spreading out to secure the buildings. Yamamoto's company had no chance to organize resistance. They were scattered through the village, exhausted, unprepared. Captain Nakamura's orders came quickly: withdraw immediately, leave equipment if necessary, break contact, and reform 5 miles south. Yamamoto's squad ran. They left their packs, taking only weapons and ammunition. They ran through rice paddies, stumbling in the mud, certain that American bullets would find them at any moment. But the Americans did not pursue aggressively. They had the village. They were consolidating their position, bringing up more vehicles, establishing a base for further advance. Chasing scattered Japanese soldiers through the countryside was not their priority. When Yamamoto's squad finally stopped, miles from the village, gasping for breath and checking who had made it, they had nothing but the clothes they wore and the rifles they carried. Their packs were gone. Their rations were gone. Their blankets, personal items, everything that made life bearable in the field, gone. That evening, as the squad huddled in a thicket waiting for orders that never came, Yamamoto understood something fundamental had changed. The Americans had moved faster than his regiment could march. They had arrived at the village before Japanese forces could organize a defense. They had taken positions that should have been occupied by Japanese troops, taken them easily, taken them because they had trucks and Japanese soldiers had only their legs. The 103rd Infantry Regiment ceased to exist as an organized fighting unit by the end of January 1945. Not destroyed, in a single battle, but eroded through a series of retreats, skirmishes, and dispersals. Units became separated during night marches. Companies lost contact with battalion headquarters. Soldiers, exhausted and hungry, simply stopped walking and hid in the jungle, waiting for an opportunity to surrender or hoping to survive until the war ended. Yamamoto's squad remained together for another week. They marched south, then east, then south again, following fragmentary orders from officers who had lost contact with higher command. They foraged for food in abandoned villages. They drank from streams and irrigation ditches. They slept in the open, too tired to construct proper shelters. 3 men developed dysentery. 1 collapsed during a march and could not be revived. The squad left him by the trail with a note identifying his unit, knowing he would likely die before anyone found him. On February 3, 1945, the remnants of the squad, now 7 men including Yamamoto, encountered an American patrol. The Americans had been moving through the area in trucks, dismounting to search villages and likely hiding places for Japanese holdouts. Yamamoto's group was hiding in a grove of bamboo when the trucks stopped on the nearby road. American soldiers, perhaps 20 of them, spread out and began moving through the area. Yamamoto realized they could not escape. His men were too weak to run. They had perhaps 40 rounds of ammunition total among 7 rifles. Fighting would accomplish nothing except getting them killed. He made a decision that 2 months earlier would have been unthinkable. He ordered his men to discard their rifles and surrender. The Americans were professional. They searched the Japanese soldiers for weapons, finding only a few knives and personal items. They provided water, then loaded the prisoners onto one of their trucks. Yamamoto sat in the bed of a GMC CCKW, guarded by 2 American soldiers with rifles, and watched the Philippine countryside pass by at 30 miles per hour. In 20 minutes, the truck covered a distance that would have taken his squad an entire day to march. The prisoner of war camp was located near Lingayen Gulf, close to where the Americans had first landed. Yamamoto arrived there on the same day he surrendered, transported by truck to a processing center, then by another truck to the camp itself. He had been fed twice during the journey, given rations from American sea ration boxes. The food was strange but abundant. Crackers, cheese in a can, processed meat, chocolate. More calories in a single meal than he had consumed in the past 3 days. At the camp, American medical personnel examined the prisoners. Yamamoto was diagnosed with malnutrition, dehydration, and a foot infection that had developed from untreated blisters. He weighed 52 kilograms, approximately 115 pounds, 20 kilograms less than when he had entered the army. The American medic who treated his feet spoke through a Japanese-American interpreter, explaining that the infection could have led to sepsis if left untreated. He cleaned the wounds, applied sulfur powder, and bandaged both feet with clean gauze. Yamamoto spent the next 6 months in the prisoner of war camp. He was fed regularly, 3 meals per day, totaling approximately 3,000 calories. He gained back the weight he had lost. His feet healed. He was assigned to work details, light labor that kept prisoners occupied and contributed minimally to the American war effort. He was not abused. The Geneva Convention rules were generally followed, though conditions were Spartan and privacy was non-existent. During those months, he had time to think about what had happened. He talked with other prisoners, soldiers from different units who had similar experiences. They compared stories. They tried to understand how Japan had lost the Philippines so quickly, how the Americans had advanced so rapidly, how Japanese forces that had seemed adequate in garrison had proven so ineffective in combat. The answer, Yamamoto came to understand, was not about courage or training or fighting spirit. It was about industrial capacity and how that capacity translated to tactical mobility. The Americans could move faster because they had trucks. They could sustain operations because they had supply systems that functioned reliably. They could concentrate forces rapidly because vehicles moved divisions in hours rather than days. Every advantage the Japanese army thought it possessed through discipline and endurance was negated by American machinery. The numbers, which Yamamoto learned from English-language newspapers that circulated in the camp and from conversations with guards who spoke some Japanese, were staggering. The United States had produced nearly 3 million trucks during the war years. Japan had produced approximately 165,000 motor vehicles of all types during the same period. The ratio was more than 15-1, and American vehicles were generally larger, more capable, and more reliable. An American infantry division in 1945 had approximately 2,300 vehicles of all types. This included jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, tanks, self-propelled artillery, and specialized vehicles. The division could move itself, its supplies, and its equipment without depending on railroads or external transportation. It was a self-contained mobile city of 15,000 men. A Japanese infantry division in 1945 had perhaps 200 vehicles, and many of those were not operational due to maintenance issues or fuel shortages. The division depended on railroads for strategic movement and on foot marches for tactical movement. Its supplies moved forward on pack animals and human porters. It could not relocate quickly. It could not respond rapidly to changing situations. Once committed to a position, it fought until destroyed or until it received orders to withdraw, and withdrawing on foot while under pressure was a way to turn an organized retreat into a rout. This disparity had been present from the beginning of the Pacific War, but it had not mattered in the early campaigns. In Malaya, the Philippines in 1941 and 42, the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces had faced opponents who were unprepared, poorly supplied, or simply outnumbered. Japanese infantry marching through jungle trails had outmaneuvered enemy forces trying to defend too much territory with too few troops. The marching ability of Japanese soldiers had seemed like an advantage, but by 1944 and 45, the Americans had brought their full industrial power to bear. They had built the ships to transport millions of tons of supplies across the Pacific. They had established bases throughout the theater. They had created supply systems that functioned with mechanical efficiency. And they had given their combat units the vehicles to move at speeds Japanese planners had never anticipated. The result was predictable. Japanese units marching to defensive positions arrived too late, finding that Americans had already seized the ground. Japanese forces attempting to retreat found their routes cut off by American mechanized columns that moved faster than men on foot. Japanese counterattacks, launched after night marches that left soldiers exhausted, broke against defensive positions held by fresh American troops who had ridden to battle in trucks. Yamamoto had experienced this personally. His regiment had marched 32 miles in 2 days and arrived too exhausted to fight effectively. American units had covered greater distances in hours and engaged immediately. The physical toll of marching, which Japanese doctrine had accepted as inevitable, was a self-imposed handicap in a war where the enemy had eliminated that handicap through motorization. In August 1945, Yamamoto learned that Japan had surrendered. The news came through official channels, announced to prisoners by the camp commandant. Emperor Hirohito had spoken on the radio, the first time the emperor's voice had been broadcast to the Japanese people, instructing his subjects to endure the unendurable and accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. Yamamoto's reaction was complex: relief that the war was over, that he would not die in combat or from disease in the jungle; shame that Japan had been defeated, that the empire his generation had been taught was invincible had been forced to surrender; and a certain grim vindication of what he had come to understand during his months in captivity. Japan had lost because it could not match American industrial production. The marching ability of Japanese infantry, the endurance training, the emphasis on fighting spirit, all of this had been insufficient. Courage could not overcome the material disparity. Discipline could not substitute for trucks. No amount of spiritual strength would make a soldier march faster than a vehicle could drive. When Yamamoto was repatriated to Japan in early 1946, he returned to a country devastated by war. Cities had been firebombed. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been destroyed by atomic weapons. The industrial base that had never been adequate to sustain a modern war was in ruins. Millions of men like Yamamoto were returning from overseas, trying to rebuild lives in a society that had been fundamentally transformed. He rarely spoke about his war experiences. When asked, he would say he had served in the Philippines, had been captured, and had survived. He did not describe the marches, the hunger, the moment when he had realized that everything he had been taught about Japanese military superiority was based on false assumptions. Those memories were private, processed internally, understood but not shared. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and industrialized, Yamamoto watched his country embrace the very technologies that had defeated it. Japanese factories began producing trucks, then cars, becoming eventually one of the world's largest automobile manufacturers. The highways built across Japan in the 1960s and 70s carried millions of vehicles, moving people and goods with an efficiency that would have seemed impossible in 1945. Yamamoto lived to see Japan become wealthy, peaceful, and thoroughly motorized. He never owned a car himself, preferring to walk or use public transportation, but he recognized the irony. The country that had sent its soldiers to war on foot, that had believed marching ability was a military virtue, had become a nation where almost no one walked long distances if they could avoid it. The lesson of the GMC trucks on Route 3, the lesson that had been burned into his consciousness during those weeks in January 1945, was a lesson Japan had learned permanently. Industrial capacity matters, logistics matters, the ability to move forces quickly and efficiently matters. Fighting spirit, while valuable, cannot substitute for material superiority. These were truths purchased at terrible cost, written in the lives of hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers who had marched to battlefields they could never win. The story of Japanese soldiers marching while American soldiers rode trucks is not a story about a single battle or a dramatic moment of technological revelation. It is a story about the cumulative weight of industrial disparity, about how small advantages multiply across thousands of engagements, about how a seemingly simple factor like transportation method can determine the outcome of campaigns and wars. Every mile a Japanese soldier marched was a mile that exhausted him, that reduced his combat effectiveness, that increased his caloric needs and his vulnerability to disease and injury. Every mile an American soldier rode was a mile that conserved his strength, that allowed him to arrive fresh and ready to fight, that made his unit more flexible and responsive to changing conditions. Multiply this across millions of soldiers and hundreds of operations, and the result was inevitable. The Japanese army, for all its discipline and fighting spirit, could not overcome the fundamental disadvantage of fighting a motorized opponent while relying primarily on foot movement. The Americans moved faster, fought more effectively, and sustained operations longer because they had eliminated the physical cost of movement from their tactical calculations. The 30 miles that Yamamoto's regiment marched in 2 days was a point of pride for Japanese soldiers, evidence of their superior endurance, but it was also evidence of their fundamental disadvantage. Those 30 miles cost them days of operational time, enormous physical effort, and combat effectiveness that could not be recovered before engagement. The Americans covered the same distance in hours, arrived stronger, and fought better because they had trucks. This was not the only reason Japan lost the Pacific War. Naval and air superiority, industrial production of ships and aircraft, the ability to replace losses, strategic decisions made years before the war began. All of these factors contributed. But at the tactical level, where soldiers met soldiers and units maneuvered against each other, the difference in mobility was decisive. Japanese military planners before the war had understood theoretically that motorization provided advantages, but they had underestimated the scale of American motorization and overestimated the importance of traditional infantry virtues. They had believed that Japanese soldiers, through superior training and spiritual strength, could compensate for material disadvantages. This belief was tested in combat and found completely inadequate. The men who suffered the consequences of this miscalculation were soldiers like Yamamoto, who had done everything their training demanded, who had marched the required distances and maintained the required discipline, and who had discovered that their best efforts were insufficient. They had walked to battlefields where their opponents arrived by truck. They had fought exhausted against fresh troops. They had retreated on foot, unable to move faster than pursuing mechanized columns. And they had learned, through bitter experience, that modern industrial warfare favored the side with greater material resources, not the side with greater spiritual commitment. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.